So Sabrina Amrane is a graduate student here at UC Berkeley, and her work focuses on the Maghrib region. And I want to just read a sentence from her because I think it helps explain the connection here. She says, her research explores the political thrust of major but overlooked oasis cities within the wider trans-Saharan network, interactions between key Saharan actors and coastal imperial rule, and conceptions of territoriality within a nomadic milieu in the medieval Maghrib. And she draws on repositories of written material and oral histories. So with no further ado, I will introduce Sabrina Amrane, who's going to be talking to us about text sources in the making of West African history.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that introduction. Let's see if this works. Okay, perfect. Let me just hit share. Okay, I'm excited to talk to you guys about, yes, the making of West African history, specifically in the Middle Ages, through its textual sources. I think that was a really good transition from the Gold Road interactive map that we saw in some of the profile badges. But to emphasize the previous presenters, it's always worth addressing the misconception that West Africa is the periphery to the Islamic East, or what's considered the center of the Muslim world. This is, of course, also relevant to the Islamic West more broadly, including parts of North Africa, known as the Maghrib or Maghreb. But this kind of marginalization has definitely affected how we situate West Africa even more pervasively. But we can challenge this idea by embracing the more accurate picture of intercommunicated geographies, not only on a transcontinental level, but at a regional one. West Africa had and has its own scholarly nuclei within this highly mobile Saharan space. So with that, we should also abandon this binary between North Africa and what we call sub-Saharan Africa, because it is by way of the Sahara that many of our textual sources are produced and set the stage for the proliferation of local documentary evidence. So already we can say that West Africa isn't marginal or shouldn't be seen as marginal because it too has a rich textual tradition. We had the wonderful keynote speech about the myth of illiteracy in Africa. Part of this job of rethinking its image is also by acknowledging the merit of oral sources as types of texts that are transmitted across generations and are not methodologically inferior to textual sources. Orality and textuality have always been entangled, even in Europe, for that matter. And this is, of course, not to undermine the power of writing in West Africa, which, forgive the redundancy, takes shape with the spread of Islam, trans-Saharan trade, and the emergence of Arabic as a lingua franca within these mercantile and intellectual networks. Arabic wasn't just a liturgical language, it was widely used for commerce, diplomacy, and correspondence between West African polities and the Maghrib, Egypt, and further afield. With the rise of Islamic centers like Timbuktu, Djenné, and Gao, Arabic became the medium for major activities and the primary language of elite education. So by the 13th century onwards, we see Arabic take on a real administrative and historiographical role in the West African Middle Ages, mirroring trends in North Africa, albeit on a different timeline. Okay, material culture / archaeological records are, of course, outside the scope and focus of this presentation, but there's already much to be said about the textual sources available, and as we already know, can be categorized into Arabic and Ajami manuscripts. The Arab geographers, cartographers, and historians behind the Arabic manuscripts are also usually considered very authoritative for knowledge of the Maghrib or Northwest Africa. So we have big names like al-Bakri, Ibn Khaldun, etc. And to repeat once more, Ajami refers to the use of the Arabic script to write African languages like Hausa, Wolof, Fulfulde, and the list goes on. Ajam is an Arabic word that just means non-Arab. And because of what we learned just now, it wouldn't be accurate to think of this distinction as external versus internal, since Arabic manuscripts are not always necessarily written by Arab and Berber visitors from North Africa, though these do tend to be the majority that survived before the 16th century. We also have locally produced Arabic texts by writers in mixed communities. So the Timbuktu Chronicles are a really good example of this. These are a collection of canonized texts that are key for knowledge of the Songhai Empire, its interactions with the Saadi dynasty in modern-day Morocco, and the legacy of medieval Mali in general. And they're said to be authored by Mahmoud Kati and Abdurrahman As-Saadi, who are both Timbuktu natives. And we can see Ajami writings appear very early, as we learned, but most that serve our historization of the region survive in the later end of the Middle Ages, primarily concentrated in regions like Timbuktu and Kano during the Mali and Songhai periods. We have many Ajami sources, for instance, that reflect the commercial strength of the Songhai Empire and emphasize the role of Aske Muhammad in expanding Islamic governance. The Epic of Sondiara, which recounts the founding of the Malian Empire, is exemplary of an oral tradition that's preserved not only through recitation in mnemonic forms, but eventually are transcribed onto parchment. So even if they do come in fewer numbers during the Middle Ages, Ajami texts composed later still serve as really important repositories for historical memory of an earlier epoch and the region's connection to the wider Muslim world. Lastly, a griot or a griot is a member of a class of professional poets and storytellers in West Africa, and many have memorized histories of Islamic scholars, political leaders, and empires to this day, making them an integral component to this mosaic. A part of any training in historical thinking skills is, of course, knowing who produced what and the context that they come from. So the Arabs and Berbers writing about West Africa tend to be scholars, merchants, and travelers across the centuries. And like any pre-modern encounter with the other, in articulation of cultural difference, one has to understand the bias and audience of the author. So when the ancient Greek historian Herodotus travels to Egypt, there had already been meaningful contact between both sides of the Mediterranean. There were Greek mercenaries who were invited to teach Egyptians Greek. So he's marveled by the hygiene and piety that he witnesses. He accredits many Greek practices to the Egyptians. But he's also stunned by what he considers to be very strange customs. He's saying that women are the ones who are peeing standing up and men are the ones peeing sitting down. And so the nuances of his description need to be read through the niceties of his time, and a general recognition that one's assessment of the other is often more revelatory of defining what was acceptable in the author's own society than of the one that they're more ultimately unfamiliar with. Making their testimony prone to exaggeration or unverifiable details. So this stands just as true for the 14th century traveler Ibn Battuta, who's highly impressed by Mansa Musa's brother's wealth in Mali, but also critical of his supposed stinginess after he falls sick during his journey. So even within this shared Islamic milieu, we have these interactions colored by certain expectations for how people should act, dress, and speak. So the key here is to balance external accounts with local traditions when possible. But even if we're limited, then it's at least paramount that we teach students to analyze sources critically and not take everything for face value. So even for one of the most credible geographers like Al-Bakri, for instance, his account is based on reports from other traders and travelers since he had never been to Ghana himself. And so his work naturally reflects secondhand information. The Soninke epic of Ouagadougou, on the other hand, contains elements of historical significance, like the importance of gold in trade and the kingdom's governance by the ruling Cizé family from a local perspective. The Epic of Sanjata is another oral tradition that emphasizes the transition from the Ghana Empire to Mali, the unification of the Madinga people, and the role of Islam in legitimizing Mali's rulers. Unlike Al-Bakri, Ibn Battuta does provide an external eyewitness account, but he has a scribe who records his his narratives later. During the Mali and Songhai Empire is when we have a multiplicity of Arabic and Ajami manuscripts that cover a range of topics, including historical events. So the list here is, not at all exhaustive. But after that overview, I think it's useful to see what it looks like to deal with an external account of West African history in the classroom. So first, if we think of learning objectives within a unit, excuse me, I'm getting it all right. Okay. So yeah, if we think of learning objectives within a unit, we might imagine that students are expected to broadly understand the processes through which Islam came to West Africa and became an important apparatus for state building, which, as we said, involves trans-Saharan trade, circulation of texts, contact between Arabs, Berbers, and West African groups, and the establishment of intellectual centers. Within the framework of a specific lesson, students might be asked to focus on activating the historical skills of context and complexity. So by dispelling the narrative dimensions and subjective voice of travel diaries as sources, for example, students can understand how the past can be defogged through analyzing bias. So yeah, putting up the famous manuscript image of Mansa Musa holding a gold coin with some reference to his modern estimated net worth of $400 billion, alongside a profile badge in the classroom is always a fun way to catch students' attention. Right off the bat, I think it'll be easy to exercise their imagination and exhaust their excitement about asking them to think about what Mansa Musa's life could have been like. The significance of the visual source being the Catalan Atlas also demonstrates European interest in global commerce and the place of West Africa in this international and regional history. Will also set the scene for probing Ibn Battuta's accounts on Mansa Musa's brother, Ibn Battuta, who is known to have traveled far and wide. And so again, we can preface that what we know about the Malian, or much of what we know about the Malian Empire, comes from Arabic sources written by those who were coming from neighboring dynasties. A primary source activity could ask students to think critically about Ibn Battuta's biography in relation to how he described what he saw. So the goal of this activity could be twofold. Students should be able to A, interrogate the document in detail within its context, and B, come to conclusions about how Ibn Battuta's perspective of Mansa Suleiman and the Malian Empire reveals his own ideas about normative Islamic courtly life in North Africa. And so the activity asks students to interact directly with the author himself. And in doing so, they should be able to reach a deeper understanding of how positionality, experience, and intentionality shape the production of historical documents. So I have one excerpt from his travel journey to Mali. Of course, in a real activity, there would be many excerpts paired together. But even in the one that we have here, he writes it when he was sick for 2 months, when he met Mansa Musa's brother, Mansa Suleiman, who he right away calls a miserly king. But we learn about courtly conventions, right? Hosting a memorial feast, inviting elites like princesses, jurists, and preachers, reciting the Quran in full, and praying over the sultan. We also learn about a certain Ibn al-Faqih who can act as a translator in this bilingual or multilingual environment. In that next anecdote, which is not pictured here, he mocks what he sees as a tardy and trivial reception gift and confronts the sultan, after which he does receive gold. But before then, he says, "I stood before him and said, I have journeyed to the countries of the world and met their kings. I have been 4 months in your country without your giving me a reception gift or anything else. What shall I say of you in the presence of other sultans?" And so this question, he asks, points to the role that he plays in establishing people's legacies and at the mercy of, his state of mind at the time and his own preferences. He goes on after that to make fun of how they recite poetry. He expresses a level of abhorrence at how enslaved women present themselves to the sultan and walk around the palace naked. He says people apparently eat dogs and donkeys. At the same time, he expresses deep admiration for their memorization of the Quran and attendance of Friday prayer. And so the importance that he places on a reception gift affects his subsequent remarks about Malians, both positive and negative. And based on his praises and disparagement, we can learn about the norms of courtly life in North Africa and how they differ from those in West Africa. So 2 examples of questions with model responses for an instructor to use as guideposts for students whose answers will of course be they could be articulated much more simply. But we have what pleases or impresses Ibn Battuta, and what does that say about what he values? Conversely, what does he vehemently dislike? So one can say Ibn Battuta comes from an urban, affluent cultural center in Northern Africa. As part of a patronage system himself, he evaluates the sophistication of society through their mastery and performance of Arabic poetry. Ibn Battuta's crude remarks about what he sees as a pathetic execution of linguistic cadence reveals his own class and regional background. At the same time, his contentment over the locals' observance of prayer tells us about the religious expectations of Muslim dignitaries. And then how does Ibn Battuta's physical condition affect his perspective of his surroundings? What does that teach us about reading a travel account? Ibn Battuta falls sick during his time in medieval Mali, which makes him quite the grumpy observer. He criticizes Mansa Suleiman's lack of generosity, but as soon as he starts to feel better, begins praising the great attention that his servants displayed in attending to his needs. While travel accounts can give us concrete information about a place and a given time, descriptions of customs can be very referential to the author's worldview and whims. And it's also worth asking students, right, how the status of Ibn Battuta and the status of Mansa Suleiman compare and what that reveals about their interaction. So despite Mansa Suleiman being far more powerful and wealthy, Ibn Battuta has a certain authorial clout because of his background and reputation as a traveler who records his observations. So we can keep this dynamic in mind for other Arab and Berber writers whose works we rely on for information about West Africa in the Middle Ages and are, or can be like any other source, tainted by bias. This was a more, stark example, of course, of where we may need to alert students about the language that they can come across in the sources. Other texts are much more sober and dry, especially if they're just concerned with straightforward geographical or commercial aspects of life. But it's still valuable to acknowledge the locally produced narratives that make up this rich archive. And most importantly, West Africa was a space of intense interaction with other parts of Africa and by extension, the rest of the Muslim world, especially by way of pilgrimage, as we've seen, passing through other cities, charging this web of interconnectivity through trade and scholarship in the early modern period. So as such, it would be wrong to assume, of course, that it is only through the European encounter that West Africa becomes legible. And hopefully we're making great tides in revising this perception by making more space for its textual tradition in Islamic and global history in the classroom.
And I think we just have 5 minutes, so we're going to have to go kind of quickly.
Okay, good. So, well, based on the question that Melissa asked about other people during medieval times and Sabrina's excellent presentation, I just want to shift what I was going to say and hopefully I can share some presentation. Recently, Elsa and I were at the National Council of Social Studies where we shared a presentation called Beyond Mansa Musa, the Gold Road in the Time of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. So what we were trying to do with that is to show all of the different people in a role or in a profile or so-called role-playing way for students to really get engaged with the history. So I just want to show you a few of the slides in the way that we did that. We have some imaginary people in there or people that we think are based, they didn't really exist, but the common folk that are often left out of history, we have looked at the historical resources and given them a voice as well. And most of these come again with the help of David Conrad, who wrote the book on early West African Muslims. There's the jelly, and he sort of kicks off the discussion. One of the things that when we did the workshop, we wanted the people in the audience, and so this would be in the classroom, to listen to what the person is saying rather than reading the information. So we just put the name up. The person came up who was doing the profile of Dinga. They read it, and then we looked at the text. Because what we have done in the text is provide, in the bolded words, you will find these words in the Gold Road website. And we had an organizer that was created so that it was, whether is this person a person in the people category, is it a landscape, you know, of the 5 markers or that we have. So we have Dinga, just a few more I wanted to show you. And here's a farmer. This is one we created. And many of the women were often the basic farmers. And so one of the ways of getting around the fact that women don't exist in the historical record is to think about the roles that they may have played. And so I'm a farmer in Ouagadougou. We women are the backbone of this empire. Our crops, especially sorghum and millet, keep our people fed and strong, and so on. We have a gold miner, a horseman. Again, these are based on the text and historical resources that we have. I want to skip through some of these because we have another woman. This one is also a woman, as she might have been living in Agdahos, in an oasis city. And this last one I'm going to show you is a real woman, Zainab, who was the daughter of a wealthy Amazigh trader in Tunisia, and quite an interesting story about this woman, and speaks a lot about the power that women had. She wasn't a member of the elite, but it's important to have that for them to hear her story. And how many times she was married? I think it was 4 times. She had 4 husbands. So, so is that okay, Shane? I can stop
Yeah,
here.
that's great. And then I can transition to, because that's a good, so Martha, if you can go to slide 29, that would be great. There we go. Perfect. Okay, so when Brenda and Elsa and the folks who doing the Gold Road created those profiles, I spent some time creating 3 lessons. So the first one is, and this is for text analysis, but also for using this text-based information to build understanding of this place and time. So the first one is the one that Brenda and Elsa created, where you are doing that reading exercise with the voices of the Gold Road. The second one is a context exercise, where you're using the same profiles and interacting to understand social, political, and economic context and the geographic context for the empire. And then the last one is a primary document analysis. And that one uses source from al-Bakri and Ibn Halkal, who are 2 sources that were used as the foundation for those profiles. And so it asks students to basically look at them and make some assessments about the profiles and how they might modify them or not. And then the last thing I just wanted to say is to go back to close with what Sabrina was saying, is that when we are asking also about why aren't women in these sources, or what sources are about women, we're also revealing a value of our own, which is that to be written about and to have private parts of your life revealed for public consumption is a way of being respected. And I'd like to suggest that that is not the only way to see being written about publicly, that might be a thing that you might, and if you look at the Arabic sources, oftentimes when women are written about, it's in a denigrating, not all of them, but I'm just saying these travel sources, they tend to be denigrating many of the commentary. And it's a way of thinking about, like, what is the value of privacy versus publicity, and what are we saying about what we expect and what we value and how we show respect. So just a final thing there. Okay,